Imagine waking up on a planet where the oceans are frozen solid, where the very air burns with ice and sunlight barely touches the ground. Earth. Not the blue and green world we know, but a blinding, white marble drifting through the darkness of space. There was a time, over 650 million years ago, when our homeworld became a planet-sized freezer. Entire oceans turned to glass, mountains wore crowns of eternal frost, and life itself teetered on the edge of extinction. Scientists call it Snowball Earth, a mystery so strange, so powerful, it challenges everything we thought we knew about survival, evolution, and the unstoppable will of life itself. What could possibly freeze an entire planet? How did the Earth escape this cosmic prison of ice? And what secrets still sleep beneath the ancient frozen stones that once covered the world? The answers are buried deep in time, and tonight, we're breaking through the ice wall of history itself. But before we journey into this frozen past, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and join us as we uncover one of Earth's greatest survival stories, the age when the planet almost died and then was reborn in fire. Over 600 million years ago, our world faced a crisis so vast, so unimaginable, that it nearly ended the story of life before it truly began. Earth was a thriving, chaotic world. Volcanoes spewed molten rock into the skies, and continents shifted and collided, and the oceans swirled with the earliest forms of life. But something began to change. A slow, invisible chain of events started to unfold, and what began as a whisper in the air would soon silence the entire planet under an endless sheet of ice. It started with sunlight, or rather, the lack of it. The atmosphere, once rich with volcanic gases and greenhouse warmth, began to thin. Volcanoes quieted, the balance of carbon dioxide shifted, and as less heat was trapped in the atmosphere, the planet began to cool. Slowly, snow started to fall closer and closer to the equator. The once warm tropical seas began to chill. White snow reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the planet even more. It was a self-feeding spiral, a loop of ice and reflection that no force seemed able to stop. As centuries became millennia, glaciers advanced like armies of glass crawling across continents. The oceans began to freeze not just at the poles but across the entire planet. Waves stiffened into ice, seas turned to solid mirrors, and beneath them the darkness deepened. What had once been blue and alive became pale, silent, and still. The Earth, our Earth, transformed into a frozen sphere, gleaming cold and white in the blackness of space. The atmosphere changed too. With less water vapor and carbon dioxide, the air grew thin and dry. Winds howled over endless fields of ice, carving ridges into the frozen crust. Temperatures plummeted to levels beyond comprehension, the kind that shatter rock, freeze oceans to their depths, and silence even the most resilient forms of life. For millions of years, Earth remained trapped in this cosmic deep freeze. Yet, even in this lifeless world, something incredible endured. In the cracks of the ice beneath ancient glaciers, near the mouths of undersea volcanoes, tiny forms of life refused to surrender. Microbes, invisible, primitive, and powerful, clung to warmth in the darkness. They fed on minerals and gases, creating faint chemical sparks in a world that had gone dim. These microscopic survivors carried the fragile flame of life through one of the coldest, darkest ages in planetary history. Above them, the frozen Earth looked dead, but deep within, its heart was still beating. The planet's core continued to churn with molten energy. Volcanoes rumbled beneath the ice, releasing bursts of carbon dioxide into the trapped atmosphere. For millions of years, those volcanic sighs built up layer upon layer of invisible gas. Slowly, silently, the atmosphere thickened again. Then one day it was enough. The heat trapped by all that carbon dioxide began to build, melting the surface from beneath. Ice cracked and thundered as enormous sheets collapsed into the rising seas. Sunlight, once bounced away by endless white, finally found its way back into the ocean. The thaw began, and Earth woke up from its frozen coma. The transformation was violent. Floods carved new landscapes. Storms raged with unimaginable force, and minerals released by melting glaciers changed the chemistry of the oceans forever. But with that destruction came renewal. The nutrients that had been locked beneath the ice now fueled an explosion of life, new organisms, new ecosystems, and the birth of complexity itself. What began as a planet in crisis ended as a rebirth. The very freeze that had nearly killed life became the catalyst for evolution's greatest leap forward. Without the agony of Snowball Earth, the explosion of diverse, complex life that followed, the ancestors of plants, animals, and eventually humanity might never have existed. So when we look at the frozen worlds beyond our own, icy moons, distant planets, cold stars drifting in the dark, perhaps we should remember this: even in the deepest cold, life finds a way. Sometimes, a frozen planet isn't the end of a story, it's just the silence before the next great beginning. The oceans, once shimmering blue and alive with microbial life, began to freeze, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient sea and watching the water stiffen before your eyes. The waves no longer rise and fall, they stop, suspended in motion, turning into a glassy expanse that stretches from horizon to horizon. Snow falls endlessly, building upon the frozen surface, and the warmth that once rose from the water is gone. The transformation is complete. The oceans of Earth have become oceans of ice, It wasn't just the poles or the mountain peaks. The freezing spread across the entire planet. Even the warm equatorial regions, places that had never known frost, became buried under ice sheets thicker than a skyscraper is tall. Scientists believe the ice may have reached depths of nearly a kilometer, sealing off the seas beneath and trapping the last remnants of liquid water far below. Above this solid prison, the planet's surface turned silent and pale, like a frozen desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thin and biting, stripped of moisture and warmth. Clouds drifted low, heavy with ice crystals. The sunlight that reached Earth was weak, reflected back into space by the gleaming white surface. The planet, once full of color and chaos, now shimmered coldly. A white marble adrift in the dark void of space, it was so cold that even the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere may have frozen out, forming dry ice snow that settled onto the glaciers. The greenhouse gases that once warmed Earth were gone, locked away beneath the icy surface. Beneath this frozen world, though, something astonishing still stirred. Deep under the thick layers of ice, volcanic activity continued. Black smokers, hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, still pumped out superheated, mineral-rich water. Around those vents, tiny organisms clung to survival. These microbes didn't need sunlight, they fed on the chemicals spewing from the planet's molten core. In the absolute darkness, in the silence of the deep, life refused to die. But above them, the ocean was a world of deathly stillness. The thick ice blocked sunlight from reaching the water below, stopping photosynthesis almost entirely. The microorganisms that had once thrived on sunlight perished. Only the most resilient forms of life, the extremophiles, survived in small, hidden sanctuaries. Every living thing was fighting a quiet, desperate battle against the cold. The landscape of Earth was alien. Massive glaciers flowed slowly across the continents, carving valleys and grinding mountains into dust. Winds howled at hurricane speeds, carrying icy particles that scarred the rocks and left behind smooth, polished surfaces. The sea level dropped as water turned to ice, exposing the continental shelves. Entire regions of the planet disappeared beneath layers of frost so thick that even the tallest peaks were buried. If someone could have seen Earth from space, it would have looked eerily beautiful, bright, pure, and utterly lifeless. The oceans, once in motion, were now vast white plains. The continents, barely distinguishable beneath the snow, gleamed like ghostly shadows. The planet had fallen into a stillness so complete that even the passage of time seemed frozen. And yet, within this stillness, the seeds of the future were waiting. Beneath the frozen crust, pockets of liquid water persisted, shielded from the cold by layers of insulating ice. Inside these pockets, simple life endured. The chemical reactions within these hidden worlds may have even continued to evolve, slowly preparing life for what was to come when the thaw began. This frozen Earth wasn't just a world on pause, it was a world transforming. The layers of ice that smothered it would later melt and release ancient nutrients into the oceans. The pressure of glaciers would reshape the land and alter the chemistry of the air and sea. What looked like a dead planet was, in truth, undergoing a long, slow preparation for something extraordinary. The frozen oceans told a story not of extinction, but of endurance. They preserved the memory of a world that refused to quit, even when the odds were impossible. In those silent depths, beneath kilometers of ice, life clung to hope. And when the fire returned, when the Earth finally began to thaw, those survivors would awaken, multiply, and transform the planet forever. The oceans of ice were not just symbols of death, they were the womb of rebirth. Within that frozen stillness, life endured its greatest trial and proved that even when the world itself seems lost to the cold, the spark of existence can never truly be extinguished. Beneath the frozen silence of Snowball Earth, while the surface lay buried under kilometers of solid ice, a secret struggle for survival raged in the darkness below. The planet's face was white and lifeless, its mountains smothered, its ocean sealed, and its skies thin and cold. Sunlight could not pierce the icy crust, and the very heartbeat of the biosphere seemed to stop. But life, stubborn, miraculous, defiant life, refused to vanish completely. It hid, it adapted, and it waited. In this vast and frozen tomb, only the smallest and most resilient forms of existence remained. Microbes, simple, microscopic organisms, became the guardians of life on Earth. While entire ecosystems above the ice perished, these tiny survivors found refuge in the few places that still offered warmth and water. Some lived in thin pockets of liquid trapped beneath the glaciers, others near volcanic vents deep in the ocean, and some even inside the ice itself, clinging to microscopic cracks and layers where salt and pressure kept the water from freezing solid. The oceans beneath the ice were dark, but not entirely dead. Hydrothermal vents, the so-called black smokers, continued to gush out scalding, mineral-rich water from the planet's molten core. Around these vents, strange and primitive communities endured. They didn't depend on sunlight because there was none. Instead, they drew their energy from chemicals like hydrogen sulfide and methane released from Earth's inner heat. This process, called chemosynthesis, became the foundation of an entire under ice ecosystem, fragile but determined. Imagine the eerie beauty of that hidden world, towering chimneys of minerals rising from the seafloor, surrounded by faint clouds of shimmering heat. Around them, in the pitch-black waters, microbial mats formed colonies that fed, reproduced, and evolved slowly over eons. To these microscopic pioneers, the ice above was irrelevant. As long as the planet's heart still burned, they had a chance. Elsewhere, other survivors adapted in astonishing ways. Near cracks in the ice, where the ocean met the air, sunlight sometimes filtered through in dim, ghostly streaks. Cyanobacteria, the ancient architects of oxygen, found ways to capture even that faint light, continuing the slow work of photosynthesis. These tiny organisms may have painted the undersides of the ice with streaks of color, living in secret beneath a world that seemed entirely dead. On land, if one could still call it land, the story was the same: emptiness and endurance. Some microbes burrowed into rocks, surviving on trace minerals and moisture locked within the stone. Others existed in dormant states, frozen in time but capable of awakening when warmth returned. Every living thing had entered survival mode, reduced to its most essential form, as though the entire planet had pressed pause on life itself. The air above this hidden world was brutally dry and cold. Snow fell endlessly and winds screamed across the glaciers. The planet's magnetic field flickered with faint auroras, dancing over an Earth that looked more like an alien moon. To the universe, it must have seemed that Earth's story had ended. But below, those invisible survivors, no larger than dust, were keeping the future alive, and this, perhaps, is one of the greatest miracles in the story of Snowball Earth. Against odds that defy imagination, these microorganisms not only survived but laid the foundation for what came next. When the ice began to thaw millions of years later, when volcanoes released enough carbon dioxide to warm the planet again, those same tiny survivors were waiting. They awoke, multiplied, and flourished, repopulating the oceans and transforming the chemistry of the atmosphere once more. Without them, the Earth would have remained silent forever. There would have been no Cambrian explosion, no coral reefs, no forests, no animals, and no humanity. Every living creature that has ever existed, from the simplest worm to the most complex human mind, owes its existence to the microscopic warriors that endured the long winter of Snowball Earth. Their world was cold, dark, and merciless, but they adapted in ways that reshaped evolution itself. They proved that life is not fragile, it is relentless. Even when the sun hides, when the oceans freeze, and when the air itself becomes poison, life finds a way to whisper, "Not yet." So in that age of ice and despair, beneath miles of frozen silence, the flame of existence burned quietly on. It flickered in the darkest depths, in the tiniest cracks, in the most improbable corners of the planet, a fragile light in an endless night. And that light, against all odds, never went out. Deep beneath the frozen stillness of Snowball Earth, while the surface remained locked in an endless winter, the planet's core was restless. Far below the crust, pressure and heat churned ceaselessly. Magma swirled and surged through fractures, pushing against the icy shell above. Though the world above lay in silence, the heart of the Earth was alive and burning. It was this hidden fire, this unstoppable furnace beneath the ice, that would one day save the planet from its frozen fate. For millions of years, volcanoes had been muffled beneath the weight of glaciers and permafrost. Their eruptions were small, their breath faint, their flames swallowed by snow. But even under those crushing layers, they continued their slow work. Each eruption, no matter how weak, released bursts of gas, especially carbon dioxide, into the thin, frozen air. Normally, this gas would have been absorbed by the oceans or recycled by life. But the oceans were sealed under ice, and most life was dormant or gone. There was nothing left to capture the carbon, so it began to accumulate silently, invisibly above the world of ice. Volcano after volcano contributed to this gradual buildup. Tiny plumes of gas over thousands of years created a greenhouse blanket around the planet. It was not enough to warm the Earth immediately, not yet. The thick ice sheets reflected sunlight back into space, defying the heat that tried to rise, but deep inside the balance was shifting. The planet was preparing for a transformation unlike anything before or since. Meanwhile, under the glaciers, molten rock carved new paths through the crust. Steam hissed from cracks in the ice, staining the white landscape with dark ribbons of ash. Entire mountain ranges of volcanoes erupted beneath the frozen seas, their fire meeting the cold head-on. The contrast was apocalyptic, molten lava meeting solid ice, turning water instantly to vapor and filling the sky with strange clouds. But this chaos was exactly what Earth needed. As volcanic activity increased, so did the release of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur all began to fill the atmosphere once more. Slowly, the invisible blanket thickened. The air that had once been razor cold began to trap a bit more heat each year. Over thousands of years, that heat built up, unable to escape. The ice that once covered the entire planet began to tremble, then to melt. It was the beginning of Earth's escape. No single eruption caused the thaw. It was the combined force of countless volcanoes, the relentless breath over ages, that turned the tide. The greenhouse effect intensified dramatically, and with the ice reflecting less sunlight as it melted, the warming accelerated. The once frozen world began to sweat. Rivers formed on the surface of glaciers, rushing toward the seas below. Massive cracks echoed through the frozen continents like the sound of thunder rolling across an alien world. And when the ice finally broke, it did not do so quietly, it collapsed in chaos. Gigantic walls of ice tumbled into the oceans, creating floods and waves that reshaped the continents. The atmosphere, thick now with volcanic gases, trapped heat like never before. Temperatures soared. In a geological blink, Earth went from a deep freeze to a global greenhouse. The volcanoes that had once seemed powerless had become the architects of renewal. Their relentless emissions had restored the balance, awakening the planet from its icy coma. But the change was not gentle. The melting unleashed catastrophic floods, washing minerals and sediments into the oceans. Carbon from the air mixed with the water, creating a chemical storm that altered the seas forever. Yet this violent awakening was the price of rebirth. Out of that chaos came opportunity. The release of minerals and nutrients from the melting glaciers fed the oceans, turning them into fertile breeding grounds. The same volcanic activity that had nearly suffocated life now provided the foundation for new growth. The Earth, once locked in stillness, was alive again, trembling, boiling, and reborn. The fire within the Earth had proven to be its greatest savior. Without it, the planet might have remained frozen forever, a silent, white monument to what could have been. But because of that deep, relentless power, the story of life continued. The volcanoes reminded the universe that even when the surface sleeps under ice, the heart of the planet still beats. And in that heartbeat lay the promise of warmth, the return of light, and the unstoppable force of life waiting to rise once more. When the ice finally began to melt, the transformation of Earth was not calm or gentle. It was violent, breathtaking, and apocalyptic. The thaw was not a quiet dripping of water beneath the sun, but an explosive, world-shaking release of energy that tore through the frozen planet like a resurrection. For millions of years, the Earth had been trapped in silence, a pale, frozen sphere drifting through space, and now, as volcanic gases thickened the air and sunlight clawed its way through the haze, that silence was shattered. The Great Thaw had begun, and nothing on Earth would ever be the same again. It started slowly as the first cracks appeared in the massive ice sheets. The glaciers that had blanketed continents for eons began to groan and fracture, echoing like thunder across the frozen wasteland. At first, the sound was faint, a whisper of change, but soon it became a roar. Huge fissures opened, stretching for miles, and rivers of meltwater began to flow across the surface. These rivers widened into torrents, carving deep scars into the ice. From above, Earth no longer looked still. It was trembling, weeping, and awakening. As the greenhouse gases built up, sunlight once again began to reach the surface. Each day, a little more warmth seeped through the atmosphere, and each degree of heat fed the melting. The white, reflective surface that had once bounced sunlight away began to shrink, revealing darker patches of ocean and land that absorbed even more heat. The process accelerated. What had taken millions of years to freeze began to unravel in a geological instant. Soon, the ice sheets collapsed catastrophically. Massive slabs of glacier the size of cities broke off and crashed into the oceans, sending tsunamis racing across the newly liquid seas. The sound of cracking, breaking, and falling ice echoed like cannon fire. Water that had been locked in ice for ages now rushed freely, flooding the continents and reshaping coastlines. Valleys were filled, plains were drowned, and ancient mountains that had been buried in frost were unveiled once more. The planet entered a period of extreme chaos. As the ice melted, the sudden release of trapped water and gases caused massive weather shifts. Torrential rains lashed the surface for centuries, while storms of unimaginable fury swept across the globe. The temperature rose sharply, creating a world of dense clouds, tropical heat, and endless lightning. It was a planet reborn in turbulence, a world that had gone from frozen stillness to fiery movement in a blink of cosmic time. The oceans, once sealed beneath a kilometer of ice, now boiled with life and chemistry. The meltwater, rich with minerals and nutrients scraped from ancient rocks, poured into the seas, creating a chemical feast. The balance of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and other elements shifted rapidly. Iron and phosphorus, trapped for millions of years under glaciers, now washed into the waters, feeding microscopic organisms. In those fertile seas, the seeds of evolution began to stir again. But the planet's rebirth was not without peril. The sudden influx of carbon dioxide made the atmosphere thick and toxic, heating the planet further. Temperatures soared to extremes. Hothouse Earth, following an ice age of unimaginable depth. Oceans turned green with blooms of life, then dark again as massive die-offs occurred. The air was filled with storms, ash, and steam as the Earth struggled to find balance once more. And yet, from this turmoil came the foundation of a new era. The massive melting, the floods, the chaos, they were part of a process that would reset the planet's climate and atmosphere entirely. The water cycle restarted. Rivers carved new paths. The continents, reshaped by ice and flood, were ready to host new ecosystems. When the storms finally began to calm, Earth was unrecognizable. The white frozen shell had given way to blues and greens once more. Oceans sparkled under the returning sun, and the air, though heavy, carried warmth again. For the first time in tens of millions of years, life could breathe freely. The survivors, those ancient microbes that had endured the long night beneath the ice, began to multiply. They spread across the newly opened seas, feeding on minerals and sunlight. filling the waters with the energy of rebirth. This was more than just a change in climate, it was the awakening of a planet. The violent thawing reshaped the Earth, not only physically but chemically and biologically. It rewired the atmosphere, filled the oceans with nutrients, and prepared the stage for the greatest evolutionary leap in history. The thaw was the bridge between extinction and creation. It was proof that from destruction life can emerge stronger, that from chaos order can be born again. The same forces that froze the Earth nearly to death had now given it the heat to live. The planet that had once been a lifeless snowball was alive again, breathing, moving, and ready for the rise of complex life. The ice was gone, the oceans roared, and for the first time in eons, Earth felt the pulse of life beating loudly once more. When the ice finally retreated and the sun once again painted the Earth with warmth, what emerged from the chaos was not the same planet that had been buried under miles of frozen silence. The long winter of Snowball Earth had changed everything. The land, the air, the oceans, and most importantly, life itself. The once frozen world that had teetered on the edge of extinction was now a place of rebirth. The Great Thaw had not simply ended an ice age, it had opened the door to a revolution in evolution. In the aftermath of the melting, the oceans, rich with minerals washed from the glaciers, became an immense chemical soup, teeming with potential. These nutrients fed the microscopic survivors that had endured beneath the ice, giving them the perfect conditions to multiply and evolve. The release of carbon dioxide from volcanoes and the interaction of newly melted water with ancient rocks altered the atmosphere, increasing oxygen levels dramatically. This transformation would set the stage for one of the most extraordinary explosions of life in Earth's history, the Cambrian explosion. But before that miracle unfolded, the planet had to heal from the violence of its rebirth. For a time, the Earth was wild and unstable. Storms raged across the young seas, and the air was heavy with moisture and heat. Continents, scarred and reshaped by the crushing weight of glaciers, slowly stabilized. New rivers carved their paths, feeding the oceans with sediment and minerals. The Earth was breathing again, not the shallow breath of survival, but the deep, rhythmic inhale of renewal. And within those newly alive waters, something extraordinary began to happen. Simple microbial life, the same kind that had once hidden in volcanic vents and cracks in the ice, began to experiment. Cells learned to cooperate, to specialize, and to combine in new ways. Life was no longer content to be invisible. It was preparing to become complex. The oceans became a cradle of innovation. New forms of algae began to thrive, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, turning the skies blue once more. The oxygen levels rose higher than ever before, creating the conditions that would allow larger and more complex organisms to evolve. This surge of oxygen also reshaped the chemistry of the seas. Iron that had once been dissolved in the ocean began to oxidize and fall to the seafloor, creating massive bands of iron-rich rock, a record of the planet's rebirth that still lies buried deep beneath our feet. The very stones of Earth remember the moment when life reclaimed its place. For millions of years, evolution gathered momentum. Single-celled organisms developed into colonies. Colonies became multicellular beings, and slowly, in the quiet depths of the ocean, the first animals appeared, simple, soft-bodied creatures that would one day give rise to every living thing on Earth. The Snowball Earth catastrophe, once a near-death sentence for life, had become the spark that ignited a chain of creation. The irony of it all is almost poetic. The planet had to freeze nearly to death to awaken to a new age of vitality. The glaciers that once suffocated life had crushed the land into fertile soil. The chemical reactions born from ice and fire had created an atmosphere fit for complex life. The survival of those tiny microbes beneath the ice had written the blueprint for the future. Without the agony of Snowball Earth, there would be no forests, no animals, no humans, no consciousness to remember it all. So when we look at the vast sweep of time, the story of Snowball Earth reminds us that destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. The same forces that nearly ended life made it stronger, more adaptive, and infinitely creative. Every living thing that breathes today carries in its cells the legacy of that frozen age, the proof that life can fall, freeze, break, and yet rise again, brighter and more determined than before. And if you haven't seen the previous topic, The Great Thaw, How the Ice Finally Melted, it's linked in the bio. There, we uncovered the violent and astonishing story of how Earth shattered its icy shell and was reborn in storms and fire. Make sure to watch it first to feel the full power of this transformation. Next up in our History Before Humans series, the Cambrian explosion, Life's Big Bang. In that episode, we'll journey into the oceans of ancient Earth as life takes its boldest step yet, from invisible microbes to creatures with eyes, shells, and hunger. It's the dawn of evolution's masterpiece, the age when the seas came alive. Until then, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story of Earth's frozen miracle, because the past still whispers through every breath we take, and the story of life has only just begun.